The world was teeth and fury. It came at her in a wave of muscle and rage, a beast born from the mountain's deepest anger. And Brenna didn't even flinch. She held her aim for one more breath, a heartbeat that stretched into a frozen eternity. Then she let the arrow fly. As if pulled by a string, her body was already moving, diving, rolling behind the rough shield of an ancient oak as a roar of pure agony ripped through the forest. The gnarl-tusk's scream shook the snow from the high branches, a miniature blizzard in the sudden, violent quiet. She was on her feet in an instant, another arrow already waiting. But the first shot, it wasn't enough. It never was with these things. The arrow jutting from its thick neck was just an insult, a spark to ignite the inferno of its rage. Its tiny black eyes, burning with hate, found her. And it charged again. There was no time for the bow. She dropped it. Her hand, slick with freezing sweat, found the familiar weight of the hunting knife at her belt. Too close. The thought was a shard of ice in her mind. As the beast's hot, rancid breath washed over her, a stench of rot and murder, her body moved on instinct. She didn't meet its charge, that was a fool's death. Instead, she sidestepped, a dancer in a deadly ballet, and threw all her weight, all her will, into a single, desperate thrust. The blade sank into the soft flesh behind its foreleg, aiming for the heart. Pain, white-hot and blinding, exploded in her side. In its death throes, a tusk, sharp as obsidian, had caught her. The force of it threw her against the tree with a sickening crack of bone on bark, stars bursting in her vision. No, she wouldn't fall. Not only that, she held on, her knuckles white, her teeth grinding as she pushed the knife deeper, deeper, twisting it as the beast's life poured out over her arm, a hot, sticky river. The gnarled tusk gave a final, shuddering gasp, and then crashed to the ground. Silence. The silence that followed was louder than the roar. It pressed in on her, broken only by her own ragged breaths and the soft, rhythmic drip, drip, drip of blood onto the snow. Hers and the beast's. Deep down, she knew the truth. She was lucky. Too lucky. She pulled at the torn leather of her tunic, her stomach clenching at the sight of the wound. It was a long, deep gash, bleeding freely. It would need stitches. Maybe it was fate that she was so far from anyone who could help. She tore a strip from her worn cloak and tied it tight around her ribs, the sharp, biting pain a familiar friend. Because of that, she knew she was alive. This was a pain she could handle, a pain she had to handle. Alone. Moments later, as she worked, her senses on fire, she saw them. Tracks. Not pack boots. These were different. Heavier. Rival clan. 3 of them. They were fresh. So fresh she could almost smell their scent on the wind, which meant they had been watching her. What's worse, they had watched her get hurt. An open loop of dread began to spin in her gut. Why were they here? Just watching? Before she could move, a sound cut through the woods, the crunch of boots on snow. Confident. Arrogant. A warrior in the Alpha's pristine silver uniform appeared. Jorik. His eyes, cold and dismissive, swept over the scene. He saw the dead gnarl tusk, the blood, her wound, and his lip curled in a faint sneer. "The Alpha summons you," he said. His voice was flat, empty of warmth. "The claiming ceremony is tonight. You are required to attend." Brenna didn't say anything. She just wiped her bloody knife clean on the beast's hide. The ceremony, a pit of vipers dressed in silk. Her stomach turned. "Try to make yourself presentable," Jorik added, his gaze lingering on the blood matting her hair. And then he was gone. Leaving her alone, just how she liked it. But for the first time in a long time, she felt a chill that had nothing to do with the wind, the rival tracks, Jorik's summons. Something was wrong. Her world was a place of harsh, clean truths, but she was about to walk into a world of beautiful, deadly lies.
Tradition, Alpha Caius, is the pack's very soul. Lord Valerius's voice was smooth as polished riverstone and just as cold. It slid across the heavy oak table of the council chambers, a room that always felt more like a tomb to Caius. A tomb filled with the ghosts of Alpha's past, all of them staring down from their portraits with silent, judging eyes. Caius held the elder's gaze. A soul, Valerius? Or a cage? One that keeps us from seeing the threats circling our walls. His motivation was simple: protect his people. But these men, these fossils, they made it so damn hard. Valerius gave a thin, condescending smile, the kind of smile that made Caius's wolf press against his ribs with a low, threatening growl. The only threat I see is a leader who scoffs at the sacred rites that have kept us strong for generations. You would divert funds from the claiming ceremony, our most hallowed tradition, for more border patrols? He said the words as if they tasted foul. The ceremony won't stop a rival clan's blade, Caius countered, his voice dangerously low. The air thickened. He could feel the pressure from the other elders, their loyalty to Valerius as solid and unthinking as rock. They were old, powerful, and they feared change more than they feared death. This was his life. A constant battle, not with claws and teeth, but with whispers and politics. He felt the weight of his father on his shoulders, a man who had loved tradition, a man who had died defending their borders. And Caius knew, with a certainty that was a cold, hard knot in his gut, that his father had died because of tradition, because he had listened to men like Valerius. A story Caius never told anyone, a wound he carried in secret. His father had been warned. The scouts had reported a buildup of forces, but the elders had insisted it was posturing. They'd insisted on completing a week-long purification ritual instead of reinforcing the patrols. His father, a good son of the pack, had agreed, and they had slaughtered him. An aide entered the room then, silent as a shadow, and handed Caius a sealed scroll. He broke the wax seal. The report was short, terse, written in a familiar, jagged script. Gnarl tusk down. Rival tracks, 3 scouts, Northern Ridge, observing. Brenna, the wild thing from the borderlands, the she-wolf who lived and breathed the threats these old men dismissed. He looked up, his golden eyes sweeping across the council. Brenna reports rival scouts on the Northern Ridge. They were watching her. Valerius actually chuckled, a dry, rustling sound. Ah, yes, the savage. Are we to tremble at every shadow the border rat claims to see? She is half feral, Alpha. Her word is questionable. Caius's jaw tightened. He could feel the rumble in his chest, a dangerous tremor. The utter disrespect not just for a skilled warrior, but for his Alpha. It was a challenge, a deliberate one. Truth be told, Valerius was testing him, as he always did. What the elder didn't know was that Caius was close to his breaking point. He needed strength, real strength. Not the performative nonsense of the ceremony. He needed warriors. He needed a partner who understood the world outside this suffocating room. In that moment, an idea began to form in his mind. A wild, reckless, and utterly desperate idea. A plot twist of his own making. He stood up, the legs of his chair scraping against the stone floor. The room fell silent. "The ceremony will proceed," he said, his voice ringing with an authority that even Valerius couldn't immediately challenge. "And I will make my choice." His eyes weren't on the elders anymore. They were looking past them, seeing a pair of fierce, defiant eyes, a face mapped with scars, a wolf who refused to kneel. He didn't know what he was about to do, not really. But deep down, he knew the truth. The pack's soul wasn't tradition. It was survival. And survival had a name. Brenna.
The Citadel was a sensory assault. After the clean, sharp silence of the wilds, the settlement was a chaotic mess of noise and smells. The air, thick with wood smoke and cooking meat, was choked with the cloying sweetness of perfumes and the metallic tang of gossip. It was a place of soft living, and to Brenna it felt rotten, weak. As she walked the packed earth streets towards the grand hall, the whispers followed her. A ripple of sound, a wake of stares. They looked at her torn, travel-stained leathers mended 100 times. They stared at the fresh, bloody bandage at her side. But most of all, they stared at her scars. The long, silvery line that cut across her left eyebrow. The puckered mark on her throat. They were a language the people of the Citadel didn't understand. Here, a woman's value was in smooth skin and fine clothes. Her value was written in blood and survival, a story they were too afraid to read. Look at her. Feral. Does the Alpha truly expect anyone to claim that? She kept her eyes forward, her expression a mask of stone. Let them look. Let them whisper. Their opinions were less than nothing to her, the buzzing of insects. Her goal was simple: get through this and get back to the woods, get back to a world that made sense. She passed vendors selling shimmering silks, jewelry that dripped with polished stones, and scented oils in delicate glass bottles. She saw other she-wolves dressed in their finest, laughing and preening, their eyes alight with ambition. They were preparing for the ceremony like it was the most important battle of their lives. And maybe, for them, it was. They would kneel before the Alpha, a display of perfect, pretty submission, and pray to be chosen, to be claimed. The thought made a growl rise in her throat. She would attend. She would stand there as required, but she would not kneel. Not for any man. Not for any Alpha. Her respect was to be earned, not demanded. And her submission, that was something she would never give. Before she could move, a young she-wolf, no older than 16, bumped into her. The girl was carrying a bolt of blue silk and she stumbled, dropping it in the dirt. "Oh, I'm so sorry," the girl gasped, her eyes wide with fear as she looked up and recognized Brenna. Brenna just stared at her for a long moment. The girl was trembling, terrified of her. Because of stories, because of whispers, because of scars. Without a word, Brenna bent down, picked up the silk, and handed it back to her. She didn't smile. She didn't offer any soft words. She just held it out. The girl snatched it back and scurried away as if Brenna had tried to bite her. And in that moment, Brenna felt it. Not anger, not frustration, just a vast, crushing loneliness. A chasm between her and all of them. A chasm she had dug herself, yes, but one they had been more than happy to widen. She reached the massive stone steps of the grand hall. The sound of music and forced laughter spilled out from the open doors. It sounded like the shrieking of caged birds. She took a deep breath, the perfumed air making her want to gag. She straightened her shoulders, a warrior walking into a different kind of war. And just like that, everything changed, because she knew with a certainty that chilled her to the bone. This battle might be the one she couldn't win alone. And that thought scared her more than any beast in the forest. The grand hall was a cavern of glittering lies. Hundreds of pack members dressed in finery that shimmered under the light of 1,000 candles filled the vast space. The air, heavy with the scent of roasted meat and cloying perfume, felt thick enough to choke on. Brenna stood near the back, a lone, jagged rock in a river of silk and velvet. Her senses were on fire. She could hear the frantic, ambitious heartbeats of the she-wolves near the front, could smell the sweat of anxiety beneath their scented oils. They were predators here, same as her, but their claws were hidden. Their weapons were smiles and whispers. A growl rose in her throat, low and threatening. She was so out of place, she might as well have been a different species. Then the horns sounded, a deep, resonant blast that silenced the chatter. Alpha Caius entered, moving with a fluid grace that seemed at odds with the heavy weight of the ceremonial alpha pelt on his shoulders. He walked to the massive carved throne on the dais and sat. His golden eyes, bright as a wolf's in the dark, swept across the crowd. Brenna felt the casual brush of his gaze, and for a breath, it felt like he saw her, truly saw her, the outcast in the shadows. But then it passed. The ceremony began. One by one, the she-wolves, the daughters of the pack's most powerful families, were presented. And one by one, they walked to the center of the floor and knelt. They knelt with grace, with practiced humility, their heads bowed in a perfect picture of submission. It was a pageant of surrender. Finally, it was her turn. Her name was called, a reluctant mutter from the master of ceremonies. Brenna of the northern border. A wave of whispers followed her as she walked forward. Her? The savage? This is an insult. She ignored them. She walked to the center of the hall, the same spot where all the others had knelt, and she stopped. She did not bow her head. She did not bend her knee. Instead, she lifted her chin and met the Alpha's gaze directly across the expanse of stone. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a wild drumbeat of defiance. "This is who I am," her stance screamed, unbroken, unbent. The silence in the hall became a living thing, a heavy, suffocating blanket. Every eye was on her. She saw Valerius on the dais, his face a thundercloud of fury. She saw the shock and scorn on the faces in the crowd. And then, she saw the Alpha.
He watched them kneel, one after another, a parade of beautiful, well-bred females all offering him the same thing. Perfect, polished submission. And all he felt was tired. It was a performance, a lie they had all agreed to believe in. He was supposed to choose the most advantageous political match, the one who would appease the elders and produce strong heirs. He was supposed to choose a doll for the pack to admire. Then they called her name. Brenna. As she walked to the center of the floor, a hush fell over the room. She was blood and iron in a room of perfume and politics. Scars were carved into her skin like a declaration of war. She wore her survival like a crown, and when all the others had knelt, she stood, her world tilted. In that moment, the entire suffocating weight of the ceremony, of the council, of his father's legacy, it all just vanished. He saw her, and she was the only real thing in the room. Her defiance wasn't an insult. It was a beacon. It was the same fire he felt in his own soul, the same desperate need for something true in a world of shadows. Deep down, he knew the truth. This wasn't a choice anymore. It was a recognition. As if his own soul, his own wolf, had pointed to her and said, "There. She is the one." Without thinking, as if pulled by a string, he rose from the throne. A collective gasp rippled through the hall. He ignored it. He ignored Valerius's hissed, "Alpha, what are you doing?" He descended the steps, his gaze locked on hers. With every step he took, the space between them burned hotter, the air crackling with something ancient and undeniable. He crossed the vast floor until he stood before her. She didn't flinch. She didn't look away. Her eyes, the color of a stormy forest, held his, challenging and questioning. He could smell the faint, clean scent of pine and the metallic tang of blood from her wound. He could see the pulse beating, fast and strong, in the scarred column of her throat. He reached out, not to touch her, but as if to hold the charged space between them. The moment their eyes locked, something inside him shifted. A bond, old as the moon, pulsed to life. And just like that, everything changed. He turned to the stunned crowd, his voice ringing with a power he hadn't felt in years. "She is the one," he declared. He looked back at Brenna, at the woman who refused to kneel, and he smiled. "She is mine."
The Alpha's chambers were a gilded cage. Moments later, she was being led through silent, ornate corridors, the guards who flanked her refusing to meet her eyes. The declaration in the hall had shattered the world, and now she was walking through the pieces. She was brought to a heavy carved wooden door and ushered inside. Alone. The room was vast, dominated by a huge hearth, where a fire crackled merrily, mocking the ice in her veins. Furs were draped over plush chairs, and a massive bed stood on a raised platform. The air smelled of beeswax and old power. It was beautiful, and it was the most terrifying place she had ever been. No matter how hard she tried, she couldn't stop the trembling in her hands. She was a warrior, but this was a battlefield she didn't understand. She was suspicious of this sudden elevation, because her entire life had taught her that nothing was given freely. The door opened behind her. Alpha Caius entered, closing it softly, the click of the latch echoing like a cell door locking. He had shed the heavy ceremonial pelt, and in a simple tunic, he seemed younger, more man than symbol. But the intensity in his golden eyes, that was all Alpha. "I imagine you have questions," he said, his voice a low rumble. Her voice, when it came, was a rasp. "What is this? Some kind of game? She turned to face him fully, her stance ready for a fight. Am I a pawn? A weapon for you to use against your council? He walked closer, stopping a few feet away. The space between them burned. It's not a game, he said, his gaze unwavering. And you are not a pawn. You are the answer. Brenna let out a short, harsh laugh. The answer? To what? I am the outcast, the savage, the border rat. Your own council despises me. Your people fear me. What could I possibly be the answer to? Her words were blades, meant to push him away, to force him to see the absurdity of it all. That's why, he said, and his voice was so earnest, so raw, it stole her breath. Because you've survived. Because you're real. I spent the evening looking at perfect dolls bred for politics and posture. I need a partner, Brenna. I need strength. The kind of strength that earns scars. He took another step. He was so close now, she could feel the heat radiating from his body. His scent, wood smoke, winter air, and something else, something wild and male, wrapped around her, making her thoughts spin. I am not your partner, she bit out, though her own body was betraying her, her wolf stirring with a curiosity that infuriated her. Aren't you? He asked softly. He lifted a hand, and before she could move, he gently traced the long scar over her eyebrow with the tip of his finger. His touch was lightning. Fire bloomed beneath her skin. As if the world narrowed to that single point of contact, her heart skipped a beat. She jerked back as if burned. Don't touch me, she snarled. He dropped his hand, his expression unreadable. Fine. He took a step back, giving her space. The tension broke, but the echo of it remained. I know you don't trust me. I don't expect you to. But understand this, Brenna. I didn't choose you to insult my enemies. I chose you because I believe you are the only one who can help me save this pack. Before the words left her lips, she was already shaking her head, denying it, denying the strange pull she felt toward him. He saw the fight in her eyes, the ingrained distrust. He sighed, a sound of deep weariness. I don't want a mate who kneels, he said, his voice dropping to a murmur that slid under her skin. I need a partner who stands. And with that, he turned and left her alone in the beautiful, terrifying cage. Her thoughts spun, and her world, which had been so simple and brutal and true just that morning, was now a confusing, dangerous mess. The wind carried his name through the cracks in the window, and her soul for the first time didn't know which way to run.
Before the echo of his footsteps faded in the corridor, the storm broke. He was summoned, not asked, summoned, to an emergency session of the Elders' Council. He walked back into the tomb-like chamber, but the air was no longer stagnant. Now, it was electric with fury. Valerius stood before the hearth, his face a mask of cold, controlled rage. The other 5 elders were arranged like stone gargoyles, their expressions ranging from shock to open hostility. Explain yourself, Valerius spat, dispensing with all titles, all pretense of respect. Caius walked to his seat at the head of the table but remained standing. His motivation was clear. He would not be cowed. He would not let them break him on this. I made my choice, as is my right as Alpha. Your right? Valerius's voice cracked like a whip. You have the right to lead this pack, not to disgrace it. You have spit on the graves of your ancestors, Caius. You have brought a feral, scarred untouchable into the heart of this citadel and called her mate. The word was an obscenity on his lips. I called her strength, Caius retorted, his voice a low growl. The wolf was close to the surface now, his instincts surging. Something this council has forgotten the meaning of. While you polish your jewels and debate tradition, the rival clans gather at our borders. That feral untouchable has killed more of our enemies than any warrior in this room. That's why I chose her, because she is a shield for this pack, not just an ornament. Valerius began to pace, his movements like a caged panther. She is a stain on our honor, a blight on our bloodline, and a dagger aimed at the heart of our sacred laws. You were meant to forge an alliance, to choose a she-wolf of high standing. Instead, you chose ruin. What were you thinking? I was thinking of my father bleeding out in the snow because he listened to you. The words burned in his throat, but he swallowed them. That was a story for another time. Instead, he met the old wolf's furious gaze. I was thinking of our future, a future where we are strong enough to survive, not just pure enough to die. Without warning, Valerius slammed his fist on the table, the sound like a thunderclap. This will not stand. The pack will not accept this madness. Renounce her, Caius, tonight. Cast her out and choose again. Choose properly, or there will be consequences you cannot begin to imagine. The threat hung in the air, thick and poisonous, an open loop of danger. What consequences? Division? Rebellion? Civil war? He didn't know, but he saw the promise of it in Valerius's eyes. Caius stood tall, the weight of his decision settling on him, not as a burden, but as a mantle of steel. He had made his move. Now he would see it through. He looked at each elder one by one, his golden eyes blazing with the fire of the Alpha. "No," he said, his voice quiet but carrying the finality of an avalanche. "The choice is made. She is my mate. She is your future Luna, and you will all show her the respect that she is owed." He turned and walked out of the room, leaving a stunned, seething silence in his wake. The battle lines were drawn, and Brenna, whether she knew it or not, was standing right in the middle of them. The game had begun, and he had just risked his entire world on a scarred she-wolf who looked at him like he was her enemy.
Come morning, she woke to the suffocating softness of a feather bed. The light that filtered through the vast arched window was pale and timid, a prisoner just like her. For a disoriented moment, she didn't know where she was. Her body, trained for the unforgiving ground of the forest floor, ached in protest at the luxury. The air was wrong. It was still and warm, lacking the sharp, clean bite of pine and frost. It smelled of lavender and soap. Her stomach turned. This wasn't a bed. It was a trap, a cage made of comfort. Two young she-wolves entered the room, their movements timid, their eyes wide with a mixture of fear and morbid curiosity. They carried a tray with food, delicate pastries and steaming tea, and a pile of folded clothes. Silks and velvets in deep, rich colors. The Alpha thought, "You might desire something more suitable to wear, Luna," one of them whispered, refusing to meet Brenna's eyes. Brenna swung her legs out of the bed. The cool floorboards were a welcome shock to her system. She ignored the food. Instead, she walked to the pile of clothes and picked up a deep emerald tunic. The fabric was so fine, so soft, so wrong. It was a costume, a disguise. They wanted to bury the warrior under layers of the courtier. They wanted to smooth her edges, hide her scars, and pretend she was one of them. A deep, primal fury surged through her. Without another word, she took the beautiful, offensive garment, walked to the crackling fire, and simply dropped it in. The two maids gasped, their hands flying to their mouths. The silk blackened, shriveled, and vanished in a puff of acrid smoke. "Bring me my leathers," Brenna said, her voice a low, dangerous command. "And my bow." She didn't know what scared her more, the cage or the part of her that ached with a loneliness so profound it might one day be tempted to stay inside it. The maids fled. Moments later, her worn, familiar gear was delivered by a stony-faced guard. She dressed quickly, the feel of the hardened leather against her skin a comfort, an anchor. She needed to move. She needed air. She needed a fight. She found what she was looking for in the central training yard. It was a vast, packed earth arena, surrounded by weapon racks and gawking pack members. Jorik, the arrogant guard from the forest, was there, training with two other warriors. He saw her enter, and a cruel, mocking smile spread across his face. "Look what the Alpha dragged in," he sneered, loud enough for everyone to hear. "Come for a lesson in how real warriors fight, border rat?" Brenna's world narrowed. Her motivation was simple, pure. She needed to remind them, and herself, of who she was. "No," she said, her voice carrying across the yard. "I came to give one." Jorik laughed. "You and what? Your collection of scars? My scars, Brenna said, stepping into the center of the yard, are a map of all the men who underestimated me. The challenge was undeniable. The yard went quiet. Jorik and his two cronies spread out, circling her. They were bigger, stronger, and they were stupid. She could see it in their eyes. They saw a lone, wounded she-wolf. They didn't see the predator who had survived the northern wilds her entire life. The first one lunged, a big, brutish male who led with his shoulder. She didn't meet his force. Her body moved on instinct. She sidestepped, using his own momentum to spin him off balance, and brought the butt of a practice sword down hard on the back of his knee. He howled and collapsed. One down. Jorik and the other one came at her together, a classic pincer move. But they were clumsy, their movements full of pride, not purpose. She ducked under a wild swing from Jorik, the wind of it whistling past her ear, and slammed her elbow into the ribs of the second warrior. He grunted, the air leaving his lungs in a rush. As he staggered back, she spun, sweeping his legs out from under him, two down. Now it was just Jorik. His face was a mask of disbelief and rage. He came at her, his attacks no longer mocking, but deadly serious. He was fast. She'd give him that. But he was predictable. All his training was here, in this yard, against other pack warriors. Her training had been against Gnarltusks, rival clans, and starvation. He fought with rules. She fought to survive. He lunged, a blur of motion. She moved. Wood met wood with a sharp crack as she blocked his strike. He pressed his advantage, his superior strength forcing her back. But then she smiled. A cold, feral thing that didn't touch her eyes. She let him push her, let him think he was winning. And just when he overcommitted, leaning all his weight into a final crushing blow, she dropped. The momentum of his swing carried him forward, his balance completely gone. She rose up behind him, hooked her foot around his ankle, and pulled. He crashed face first into the dirt. The silence that followed was absolute. In the span of a breath, she had dismantled 3 of the Alpha's best. She stood over Jorik, her chest heaving slightly, the pain in her side a dull, angry throb. She didn't say a word. She just looked at him, her eyes promising a world of pain if he ever crossed her again. A slow, deliberate clap echoed from a balcony above. Brenna looked up. Alpha Caius was standing there, leaning against the railing. He wasn't smiling. He was just watching her. And in his eyes, she saw not shock, not anger, but a look of profound, unsettling understanding, as if he had known this would happen all along.
He found her in his private armory. Moments later, after her stunning, brutal, and politically disastrous display in the training yard, he knew he couldn't approach her in the open. Not now. So he had sent a guard, a different, more respectful one, to request her presence. He had chosen the location carefully, not the opulent chambers, not the formal council room, but here, his sanctuary, a place that smelled of whetstone, weapon oil, and old leather, a room of purpose, a room she would understand. She entered silently, her eyes sweeping over the racks of swords, the bows hanging on the walls, the neatly organized daggers. She looked more at home here than she had anywhere else in the Citadel. "That was quite a statement you made," he said, his voice even. He was leaning over a massive map table, a map of the northern territories spread out across it. "He challenged me," she replied, her voice clipped. She ran a hand over the hilt of a longsword, her touch surprisingly gentle. "He was an idiot," Caius said, not looking up from the map. "But he is a popular idiot, with powerful relatives on the council. You embarrassed him. You embarrassed them, which means you've made my life significantly more difficult." She finally looked at him. "Should I have let him beat me then? Knelt in the dirt of your training yard?" The sarcasm in her voice was sharp enough to cut. "No," he said, and he finally met her gaze. "No, I wouldn't have wanted that." He straightened up, gesturing to the map. "In fact, I needed a warrior today, not a politician. Come here." She hesitated for a beat, her suspicion a tangible thing in the air, but then she moved to the other side of the table. "Your report mentioned rival scouts," he said, his tone shifting from alpha to strategist. Show me where. Her eyes narrowed slightly, but she leaned over the map. Her finger, scarred and calloused, traced a path along the northern ridge. Here. They were observing this pass. It's a weak point. The rock formations give them cover from our sentries on the eastern wall. He nodded, his mind racing. It's the same pass they used 5 years ago, in the attack that killed my father. The air in the room stilled. The tension broke, replaced by something heavier. He saw the flicker of surprise in her eyes. He was giving her a weapon, a piece of his own pain, his own past. He didn't know why. Not really. Maybe it was a gamble, a desperate attempt to find common ground, because she understood loss. He could see it in her. That's why he'd chosen this place. Valerius was on my father's council then, too. Caius continued, his voice low, the words tasting like ash. He argued against reinforcing this pass, called it a waste of resources, said the rival clans were just posturing. He looked up at her, letting her see the old, raw grief in his eyes. My father listened to him. He chose tradition over instinct, and for that he paid with his life. He watched her, watched for any sign of pity, of the soft, useless sympathy he despised. But she gave him none. Instead, her gaze was clear, analytical. She was processing the information, understanding the stakes. So Valerius is not just ambitious, she said, her voice a low murmur. He's a fool, or a traitor. Caius felt a surge of something. Relief? Vindication? To be understood so completely, so quickly. Exactly, he breathed. In that moment he reached out, his hand covering hers where it rested on the map. Her skin was rough but warm. He felt the jolt of their connection, the bond pulsing between them, a current of heat and want. Her breath hitched. He saw the flash of panic in her eyes, the instinct to pull away. But she didn't. She held his gaze, and for the first time he saw something beyond the warrior. He saw a flicker of curiosity. Before the words left her lips, she turned her hand over, her fingers brushing against his. It wasn't a caress. It was an assessment. Then she pointed to a long, wicked-looking scar that ran down his forearm, a souvenir from that same terrible day. How? She asked, her voice barely a whisper. And he told her. He told her everything.
That night, the Grand Hall was a battlefield of a different sort. She sat beside Caius at the high table, a position of honor that felt like a pillory. The fine leathers she wore, a compromise brought to her after the incident with the silk, felt strange and stiff. She could feel hundreds of eyes on her, feel their judgment like a physical weight. But Caius, he was a solid, warm presence beside her. After their meeting in the armory, something had shifted. The space between them was still fraught with tension, but it was a different kind of tension now. It was no longer just the friction of two opposing forces. Now, it was something else. Something that made her pulse race when his arm brushed against hers. Without warning, a large, pompous-looking wolf named Marius, a known loyalist of Valerius, stood from his table. He raised his goblet, a sneer twisting his lips. "A toast," he bellowed, his voice dripping with false cheer. "To the Alpha's choice, a true she-wolf of the wilds. Tell us, Brenna, is it true you prefer the taste of raw meat to cooked? Or that you howl at the moon with your four-legged brethren?" The hall erupted in a mixture of sycophantic laughter and shocked silence. It was a direct public assault, a test. She felt Caius tense beside her, a low growl starting in his chest, ready to defend her. But before he could speak, Brenna put a hand on his arm, a silent signal. "I have this." She rose to her feet slowly, her stormy eyes pinning Marius in place. She didn't shout. She didn't snarl. Her voice, when it came, was cold and clear as ice. "It's true, Lord Marius," she said, her voice carrying to every corner of the hall. "I have eaten raw meat to survive, and I have howled my grief to the moon when I have buried those I've lost." Her gaze hardened. "But I also keep meticulous records of Border Patrol reports, and I find them fascinating." A confused murmur went through the crowd. Marius looked baffled. "For instance," Brenna continued, her voice cutting through the noise, I read a report from 3 weeks ago, a report you filed. It stated that you personally inspected the gorge sector and found all secure. Which is strange, because the report from the very next day, filed by Scout Alara, mentioned that the gorge's warning horn was broken and the tripwire snares had been cut. Work that would have taken hours. Work that you somehow failed to notice on your thorough inspection. The air thickened. Marius's face went pale. So tell me, Lord Marius, Brenna finished, her voice dropping to a deadly whisper. Do you prefer your cowardice raw? Or are you simply too incompetent to tell the difference between a secure border and an open invitation for our enemies? As the silence stretched, it was broken by a single sharp laugh from a warrior at a nearby table, then another. Within moments, Marius was sinking back into his chair, his face burning with a humiliation so profound it was a wound in itself. Brenna sat down. She had won. She hadn't used a blade, hadn't drawn a single drop of blood. She had used their own rules, their own records, against them. She glanced at Caius. He was looking at her, and the pride, the raw, unadulterated admiration in his golden eyes. It hit her with the force of a physical blow. Her heart skipped a beat, but then her gaze drifted across the hall. And she saw him, Lord Valerius. He wasn't angry. He wasn't shocked. He was watching her with a cold, calculating expression, and he was smiling, as if she had just walked into a trap she couldn't even see. And in that moment, she knew this was far from over. It had only just begun.
The silence in the citadel had become a lie. On the surface, there was peace. A tense, fragile quiet after Brenna's public humiliation of Marius. But beneath it, a current of rebellion was gathering strength. His most trusted scout, a lean wolf named Cale, stood before him in the armory, his expression grim. "It's true then, Alpha," Cale murmured, his voice low. "Lord Valerius has been holding secret meetings, at night, in the old catacombs. Many of the elders, and their most powerful bannermen, they are with him." Caius ran a hand over his face, the weariness settling deep in his bones. He had expected it. He had. But hearing it confirmed felt like a stone dropping into the pit of his stomach. "Who is still with us?" Cale hesitated. "Fewer than we'd hoped. They respect you, Alpha, but they fear Valerius more. He speaks of tradition, of the sacred laws you have broken by choosing." He trailed off, his gaze flicking to the door. "Brenna," Caius finished, his voice a low growl. "He uses her name like a curse, and my own pack members are too cowardly to stand against him." He slammed his palm down on the map table, the wood groaning in protest. "He is poisoning them, Kyle. While he preaches about honor, the rival clans are sharpening their blades. More importantly, he knew Valerius was leaving them vulnerable. He'd tried, just that morning, to force a vote in the council to double the patrols at the northern pass. Brenna's pass. Valerius had just smiled his cold, reptilian smile. "Our resources are finite, Alpha," he'd said, his voice dripping with condescension. "Perhaps if your mate is as skilled as you claim, she requires less support than others." The argument was a deliberate trap, and Caius had walked right into it. To insist would be to admit Brenna was weak. To relent would be to leave the border exposed. He had relented, and the taste of it was bile in his throat. He felt trapped, outmaneuvered at every turn. His only solace, his only true ally, was the very woman they were using as a weapon against him. He had spent the last few nights in her company, not in the Alpha's great bed, but here, in the armory, talking, planning. She was a brilliant strategist, her mind as sharp and uncompromising as the wilds she called home. And between the strategy, something else was growing. A current of heat. A shared glance that held too long. The brush of her hand against his that felt more potent than a full-body blow. He was falling for her, a truth so terrifying and exhilarating it threatened to unmake him. Kyle cleared his throat, pulling Caius from his thoughts. "Alpha. There's more." "What?" Caius snapped, his patience worn thin. "The rivals," Kyle said, his eyes dark with dread. They are no longer just scouting. My sources on the border confirm it. They are massing forces, hundreds of them, and they are gathering at the northern pass. The blood drained from Caius's face, the exact weak point, the one Valerius had refused to let him fortify. It wasn't a coincidence. It couldn't be. What's worse, Brenna was out there. She had insisted on taking a patrol herself, frustrated with the Citadel's inaction. She was out there right now. Before he could move, before he could even shout an order, a sound ripped through the Citadel. A sound no one had heard in 5 long years. The deep, mournful, terrified cry of the attack horn.
The first scream was what cut through the night. Brenna. She was already moving. The horn's echo was still bouncing off the stone walls when her blades were in her hands. She burst from her temporary quarters, not towards safety, but towards the sound of the fighting. The air was thick with the coppery scent of blood and the acrid smell of fear. Chaos. Pack members were running, screaming. Her world, which had been a confusing maze of politics, just became brutally, beautifully simple again. There was only the enemy, and there was only survival. Her instincts surged, a wild, clean fire in her veins. Find Caius. The thought wasn't hers, it was her wolf's. Caius. He was a whirlwind of pure, primal fury. "To the north wall!" he roared, his voice the Alpha's command that cut through the panic. "Archers to the battlements! Hold the line!" He moved through the chaos, shoving warriors into position, his mind a frantic, terrifying calculus of loss. This was his nightmare, his father's nightmare. But his only thought, the one that beat in his skull like a war drum, was Brenna. Where was she? He had to find her. He had to know she was alive. As if fate demanded it, he plunged into the thickest of the fighting, his sword a silver blur of death. The battle was a vortex of noise and violence. The rival clan warriors poured through the very pass Valerius had left undefended. They fought with a savage, coordinated brutality, cutting down the surprised pack defenders. And then, in the heart of the swirling, bloody chaos, they saw each other. Brenna. She saw him across the courtyard, a lion holding back a tide of wolves. He was magnificent, terrifying. His golden eyes were blazing, and he moved with a deadly grace that stole her breath. A rival warrior, a brute of a man, came up behind him, his axe raised for a killing blow. "Caius!" she screamed. Caius. He heard her voice cut through the din, a beacon in the storm. He spun, just as the axe swung down. He blocked it, the impact jarring his entire body. And then she was there. A blur of dark leather and flashing steel appearing from the chaos like a Valkyrie. She drove her blade into the warrior's side, a swift, merciless strike. The moment their eyes locked, the world fell away. There were no words. There was no time. The space between them burned. Between one breath and the next, they were back to back, and they became one. He was the rock, the anchor, his powerful swings carving a circle of death around them. She was the wind, a fluid, deadly dance, her twin blades a storm of motion. He would block a blow aimed for her head. She would gut the warrior who tried to flank him. It wasn't a strategy they had planned. It was instinct. It was the bond, forged in defiance and tempered now in blood and fire. This was what he'd seen in her. This was the strength he'd craved. Something inside her shifted. Her heart, so long a frozen, guarded thing, cracked open. In the midst of death, surrounded by fire and screams, she felt a sense of belonging so fierce, so profound, it brought tears to her eyes. She wasn't a lone wolf anymore. She was part of a hunt. His hunt. He felt it too. The desperate loneliness that had haunted his rule, the crushing weight of his crown. It eased. He wasn't just an alpha fighting for his pack. He was a wolf, fighting for his mate. And just like that, everything changed. He threw his head back and let out a true alpha's roar, a sound of pure, untamed power that was not a command but a declaration, a promise. And she answered with a battle cry of her own, a wild, sharp sound of a she-wolf who had finally come home. In the quiet that followed, the silence was worse than the screams. The battle had been won, barely. The remaining rival clan warriors had broken, fleeing back into the night. But the cost? The cost was etched into the stones of the courtyard. The ground was slick with blood, the air thick with the groans of the wounded and the stench of death. Brenna moved through the carnage, her body a single throbbing ache. But her mind was unnervingly clear. Caius was at her side, his presence a solid, reassuring warmth. They moved as one, directing the healers, offering comfort to the dying, their new dynamic evident to everyone who watched. He would give a command, and she would already be moving to execute it. She would spot a weakness, and he would already be sending warriors to shore it up. The pack, in their grief and shock, saw it. They saw their alpha, and they saw his mate. Not an outcast. A queen of war. But as she worked, her scout's brain was piecing things together. Things that were wrong. The enemy had known exactly where to strike. They hadn't just poured through the pass. They had targeted the armory's west wall, a lesser-known structural weakness. They had avoided the barracks of the Southern Guard who were fiercely loyal to Caius. They had moved with an insider's knowledge. Her thoughts spun. Valerius, stonewalling the reinforcements. Marius, the incompetent lord whose patrol had missed the cut snares weeks ago. It was a pattern, a trail of deliberate, malevolent negligence. The pieces clicked into place, forming a picture so ugly, so treacherous, it made her blood run cold. She found Caius near the main gate, his face grim as he looked out at the dead. She walked up to him, her movements stiff. He turned to her, his golden eyes full of pain and exhaustion. He reached out and gently brushed a smudge of blood from her cheek, his touch sending a jolt through her. "We held," he said, his voice rough. You saved us, Brenna." She shook her head, the praise turning to ash in her mouth. She looked at him, her own eyes hard as flint. The bond pulsed between them, a current of shared grief and burgeoning hope, but she had to shatter it, because the lie was worse than the truth. "No," she said, her voice a low, chilling whisper that was for him alone. "We didn't win. They were invited." She saw the confusion in his eyes, then the dawning horror as her meaning sank in. "This wasn't an invasion, Caius," she said, the words falling like ice chips into the night. "This was a betrayal."
The night bled into a grim, gray dawn. Caius hadn't slept. He couldn't. Brenna's words echoed in the ashes of the battle, a chilling counterpoint to the groans of the wounded. This was a betrayal. He knew it was true. He felt it in his bones, a sickness that had nothing to do with the carnage outside. The enemy wasn't just at the gates. The enemy was in his hall, at his table, wearing the faces of his own council. Moments later, they were in the armory, their sanctuary, their war room. The door was barred, the air thick with the scent of old steel and a new, desperate urgency. A single lantern cast long, dancing shadows on the walls, making the racks of weapons look like the teeth of some great beast. Brenna moved like a ghost in the dim light, her exhaustion a tightly coiled thing beneath her skin. And he could not take his eyes off her. He watched as she paced, her mind clearly working, piecing together the puzzle of their ruin. He trusted her instincts more than he trusted his own laws, because his laws had failed him, while her instincts had kept her alive. "They knew our patrol schedules," she murmured, her voice a low rasp. She stopped at the map table, her finger tracing the path of the invasion. Not just the schedules, Caius. They knew the gaps in the schedules. They knew which watchtowers had older warriors with slower eyes. Her own eyes, sharp and fierce, lifted to meet his. "That's not battlefield intelligence. That's pillow talk. That's information that comes from inside." He nodded, his gut clenching. He slid a heavy, dust-covered ledger across the table. "Patrol rosters, supply manifests. I've been looking all night. It's a mess. Half the records are incomplete. Or intentionally sabotaged," she finished for him. She began to leaf through the pages, her movements quick and efficient. While he saw numbers and names, she saw patterns. She saw lies. As the silence stretched, he found himself just watching her, the way the lantern light caught the silver in her scars, the fierce concentration in her eyes. Without thinking, he reached out and took her hand. She flinched, but didn't pull away. "Brenna," he said, his voice softer than he intended. "We are in this together now. I need you to know that." She looked down at their joined hands, her expression unreadable. "You don't know me, Caius." "I know your strength," he whispered. "I know your courage. I know that when the world was burning down around us, you were the only thing that felt real." The air thickened, the space between them crackling with an energy that had nothing to do with war and everything to do with the primal, undeniable pull of the bond. Her wolf stirred. He could feel it, a wild, curious thing calling to his own. Her breath caught, and just like that, everything changed. She didn't pull her hand away. Instead, she squeezed his, a brief, fleeting gesture of, what? Trust? Alliance? He didn't know, but it was enough. "There," she said suddenly, her voice sharp, pulling them both back from the edge. She pointed to a page in the ledger. "Here, the week before the attack, a night patrol was rerouted from the northern pass to the southern logging camp. The reason cited, Gnarl Tusk sighting." "The South hasn't had a Gnarl Tusk in a decade," Caius said, his blood running cold. "Exactly," Brenna breathed. "And the warrior who authorized the change?" She traced the signature with her finger. "A lieutenant fiercely loyal to Valerius, the same one I saw leaving the catacombs 2 nights ago." They had it. Their first real thread, their first solid lead. In the stillness that followed, he looked at her, and he knew he was lost. He was an alpha, a leader, a king in his own right. But in that moment, he would have burned his entire world down just to keep her safe.
She felt like a goat tethered to a post waiting for the tiger. That was the plan anyway, her plan. Caius had hated it. His reaction had been a low, guttural snarl, an alpha's absolute refusal to put his mate in danger. But she had faced him down, her own will a match for his. "You hunt with politics and records, Caius," she had told him, her voice hard. "I hunt with teeth and traps. Let me hunt." And so, here she was, riding with a small, deliberately vulnerable guard, carrying a chest supposedly filled with silver for a trade tribute. It was a lie, a piece of bait. The false information had been carefully leaked to a known gossip loyal to Valerius. If the traitor took the bait, they would be waiting. The forest was quiet, too quiet. Her heart pounded a steady, heavy rhythm against her ribs. But for the first time in her life, the fear was different. It wasn't the cold, sharp fear of a lone wolf. It was a shared fear, and that somehow made it lighter. She knew Caius and his most loyal warriors were shadows in the trees around her, watching, waiting, trusting someone to have your back. It was a strange, terrifying, and exhilarating feeling. Without warning, they exploded from the trees. At least a dozen warriors, their faces masked, swarmed them. They were fast, brutal. Her guards, part of the ruse, put up a token fight before being overwhelmed. But Brenna fought. She was a whirlwind of steel, her blades a silver song of death. She took down 2 of them before a third managed to hook her leg, sending her sprawling. A massive warrior stood over her, his sword raised for a killing blow. And just like that, the forest erupted. Caius was a storm of raw fury. He burst from the trees, no longer an alpha playing the politician, but a primal force of nature. His roar of pure, possessive rage shook the very leaves. His loyalists followed, and the ambushers, caught completely by surprise, were cut down in a brutally efficient counter-assault. Brenna watched him fight, and her breath caught in her chest. He moved with a grace and power that was utterly breathtaking. He was fighting for her, for them. The bond between them flared, a white-hot pulse of connection so strong it made her gasp. "Mine," a voice growled in the back of her mind. Her wolf. And she let it happen. When the fighting was over, they had 5 prisoners, all of them known bannermen of Lord Valerius. It was a victory, a clean, decisive win. Later, in the dungeons, the mood was less triumphant. The prisoners were sullen, silent. They would die before they betrayed their lord. "It's not enough," Caius growled, pacing the cold, damp stones. We have the soldiers, but not the general. Valerius will claim they acted alone. He will disavow them, and we will be no further than we were. Brenna looked at the prisoners, at their hard, fanatic faces. She had seen men like this before, loyal to a cause, even a rotten one. But there was always a weak link. Her eyes settled on the youngest of them, a boy with fear in his eyes that his blustering couldn't quite hide. She walked to his cell. You have a sister, don't you? She asked, her voice soft. Ilara, the scout. The boy's head snapped up, his eyes widening. She's a good warrior, Brenna continued, her voice gentle. Brave. It would be a shame for her to lose her only brother because he chose to die for a traitor. She let the words hang in the air. Valerius doesn't care about you. To him, you are just a tool, a piece to be sacrificed. But your sister, she would mourn you. She watched the boy's resolve begin to crumble. She didn't know what scared her more, that she was right, or that she had learned to use the pack's connections, their emotions, as a weapon. That night, as the silence roared in the dungeon, a guard came to them. The boy would talk, and he would name Lord Valerius.
He walked into the council chamber like a man walking to his own coronation. The confession from the young warrior was all he needed. It was ironclad. He held the signed testimony in his hand, a death warrant for Lord Valerius. For the first time since the attack, he felt the solid ground of his authority beneath his feet. Brenna stood just behind him, a silent, deadly shadow. Her presence was his strength. Valerius was already there, flanked by the other elders. His expression was one of cold, aristocratic boredom. Alpha, Valerius said, his voice a condescending drawl. To what do we owe this dramatic interruption? Caius didn't waste time with pleasantries. He strode to the center of the room and threw the confession onto the table. I have a confession, he announced, his voice ringing with power. From one of your men. A full account of your treason. How you colluded with the rival clans. How you orchestrated the attack. How you are responsible for the deaths of our people. The elders gasped, their faces paling. But Valerius just smiled. And in that moment, Caius knew he had made a terrible mistake. My, Valerius said, picking up the parchment and glancing at it with theatrical disinterest. A confession, you say? Obtained under duress from a terrified boy, no doubt. A flimsy, pathetic attempt to consolidate your failing power. It is the truth, Caius roared. Truth? Valerius chuckled, a venomous sound. You want to speak of truth, Caius? Let us speak of truth. He snapped his fingers. A guard entered, carrying a locked wooden box. Valerius opened it and pulled out a stack of letters tied with a ribbon. The truth, my dear Alpha, is that your feral mate has been playing you for a fool since the day she arrived. He tossed the letters onto the table. They scattered, revealing Brenna's distinctive, jagged handwriting. These are letters to the rival clan's Alpha, detailing our weaknesses, offering her services, all dated before you so foolishly claimed her. Caius froze. He stared at the letters, his mind refusing to process what he was seeing. It was impossible. A lie. Forged, he snarled. Are they? Valerius countered, his voice like silk and poison. Her history speaks for itself. A loner, a wanderer. No true loyalty to the pack. She has spent years on the border, with ample opportunity to make arrangements. She stood defiant at the ceremony, not out of strength, but because she was already promised to another. She is the traitor, Caius, and you brought her right into our home. His world tilted. He looked from the letters to Brenna. Her face was a mask of shock, of disbelief. He saw her lips part to deny it. But what could she say? Her entire life, her solitude, her otherness. Valerius had twisted it all. He had used her strength, her very essence, and turned it into a weapon against her. He accused my mate of treason. He accused my Alpha of tyranny. He accused our future of being a lie. This is madness, Caius choked out. Valerius's smile widened. No, this is justice. He stood tall, his voice resonating with ancient authority. And I, as head of this council, call for a trial by ancient law to determine the guilt of the she-wolf Brenna, a trial that I shall oversee. The room spun. Caius was trapped. He was outmaneuvered. He was a king in check, and the life of his queen was the prize. The battle wasn't over. It had just moved to a killing ground from which there was no escape.
The dungeon was colder than any winter in the northern wilds. It was a cold that had nothing to do with the air and everything to do with the stone. The stone walls seemed to drink the warmth from her body, leaving a deep, unshakable chill in her bones. There was a single slit of a window high up showing only a sliver of a dead gray sky. This was her world now. 4 walls, a stone floor, and the crushing weight of a lie. Her strength, her skills, her entire life of survival. They were useless here. There was no beast to hunt, no enemy to fight, only the slow, creeping poison of helplessness. Her whole life she had believed that to be alone was to be strong. She had built a fortress of solitude around her heart, and now she was trapped inside its ruins. The very things that had defined her, her isolation, her lack of connection, her time spent on the borders, had become the bars of her cage. Valerius had used her own life as a weapon against her, and she had no defense. Because who would speak for the lone wolf? Who could vouch for a character she had never shown to anyone? A few hours, or was it days? Later, the heavy bar on her cell door scraped back. Lord Valerius entered, a torch-bearing guard behind him. He moved with the smug confidence of a predator who had its prey cornered. He even smiled at her. "Comfortable, my dear?" he asked, his voice dripping with false concern. Brenna just stared at him from the floor where she sat, her eyes burning with a cold, quiet hatred. "It doesn't have to be like this, you know," he continued, circling her cell. "A word from you. Just one word. And this all goes away." "What word?" she rasped, her throat raw. "Unfit," Valerius said, his eyes glittering in the torchlight. "Declare Caius unfit to rule. Testify that his reckless passion for you has clouded his judgment that he is a danger to the pack. Support my claim to the Alpha's seat, and I will spare your life. I might even find a place for a useful tool like you." The silence in the cell was absolute. He wasn't just offering her an escape. He was offering her a betrayal so profound it would shatter the very soul of the man who had stood for her. The man who had looked at her scars and called them strength. The man who had, against all reason, chosen her. Her body moved on instinct. She surged to her feet and spat in his face. Valerius didn't even flinch. He slowly wiped the spittle from his cheek, his smile never wavering. "A pity," he said softly. "I do so hate to see a fine weapon go to waste. You will be tried at dusk 3 days from now, and you will be found guilty." He turned and left. The heavy door boomed shut, the bar sliding home with a sound of utter finality. And she was alone. Truly, utterly alone. Not by choice, but by design. In that moment, the rage finally broke, and a single, hot tear traced a path through the grime on her cheek. Because he was right. Her entire life had been a testament to her treason. She had built her own pyre, and now Valerius was simply going to light the match.
He was a king in a cage of his own making. The citadel, his seat of power, had become his prison. Every corridor felt like a trap. Every friendly face could be a mask hiding a traitor. He had the title. He had the authority. But he was politically paralyzed, and the feeling was a venomous rage coiling in his gut. He had spent the hours since the council meeting trying to rally support, to find some legal loophole, some way to fight back. But Valerius had been thorough. The ancient laws for a trial of this nature were clear, and they gave all power to the head of the council. To him. Any move Caius made to free Brenna by force, any attempt to dismiss the council, would be seen as tyranny. It would prove Valerius's claims. It would shatter the pack, plunging them into a bloody civil war they could not afford, not with the rival clans watching from the shadows. He sought out Lord Elian, an old, respected elder whose son Brenna had personally carried from the battlefield. He found him in the gardens, staring at the winter-dead roses. Elian, Caius began, his voice tight. You saw what she did. She fought for us, for your son. You know this accusation is a lie. The old wolf looked at him, his eyes full of a deep, weary sadness. What I know, Alpha, is that the law is the law. And the evidence? The evidence is forged, Caius roared, his control snapping. Is it? Elian countered, his voice soft but firm. Or is it simply a story that is easier for the pack to believe? They see an outsider, a wolf who has never pledged true fealty. They see an alpha who broke with all tradition to claim her, and they are afraid. He took a step closer. The pack is a wounded beast, Caius. Valerius offers it a familiar comfort, the comfort of the old ways. You and your mate, you offer it only more uncertainty. I cannot stand with you in this. To do so would be to rip our people in two. And just like that, his last hope crumbled. Elian, a good man, a man of honor, had chosen fear over truth, because the lie was easier. Later, he found himself standing outside the dungeons. He could feel her presence through the cold stone, a faint, flickering ember of the fire that had drawn him in. He could hear the slow, steady beat of her heart, a rhythm that was becoming as familiar as his own. He was the Alpha. He could tear the door from its hinges, kill the guards, and carry her out of there. But what then? They would be fugitives, their names cursed, the pack they had fought to save devouring itself behind them. He was powerless. He pressed his hand against the cold, rough wood of the dungeon door, the symbol of his complete and utter failure. He had brought her here. He had claimed her. He had promised her his protection. And he had led her to her death. The weight of it was a physical thing, crushing the air from his lungs. I'm sorry, he thought, the words a silent, useless prayer. I'm so sorry.
In the suffocating darkness of her cell, Brenna finally broke. She pressed her back against the cold stone, her head bowed. Her whole life, she had believed her strength was a wall she built around herself. A wall to keep out the pain, the whispers, the weakness of connection. And now, she was alone inside that wall, and it was a tomb. She saw it with a terrible, soul-shattering clarity. Her refusal to let anyone in, her pride in her solitude. It had all been a lie, a shield made of fear. She had been so afraid of being hurt, of being abandoned, that she had abandoned everyone else first. And now, when she needed someone to say, I know her heart, and it is true, there was no one left to say it. The lone wolf dies alone. That was the truth of the wilds. And it was her truth, too. At the same time, in his silent, opulent chambers, Caius stood before the portrait of his father. He stared into the painted eyes, so full of honor and duty, and he saw the lie he had been telling himself. He had been so determined not to repeat his father's mistake, the mistake of letting tradition lead him to ruin. But he was doing the exact same thing. His father had chosen the council's wisdom over the scouts' warnings, and Caius, he was choosing the pack's law over his own soul, over the undeniable truth of the bond he shared with Brenna. He was letting Valerius's twisted version of tradition murder the only person who represented a real future. He was letting his father's ghost lead him to the exact same precipice. In the quiet that followed, as despair settled over them both like a shroud, something shifted. Brenna, her eyes tracing the mortar between the stones of her cell, felt something. A slight give, a loose stone. It wasn't an escape route, it wasn't freedom. But it was a flaw in the cage, a tiny imperfection in her doom, and the smallest flicker of the survivor, the warrior who refused to die, sparked back to life in her chest. Caius turned away from the portrait, the grief and guilt on his face slowly hardening into something else, something cold and clear and incredibly dangerous. If the law was the weapon being used to kill her, then he would shatter the law. He strode to his door and opened it. A single, loyal guard stood waiting. Kyle, Caius said, his voice no longer that of a despairing king, but of an alpha who had finally chosen his path. Bring me the ancient scrolls, the ones detailing the rite of challenge. I believe it's time I reminded Lord Valerius that there are traditions even older, and with sharper teeth than his.
Despair was a poison, but resolve was the antidote. He found it in the brittle yellowed pages of the ancient scrolls, in laws written in blood, not ink, the right of challenge, a tradition so old, so primal, that even Valerius in his talk of sacred laws had forgotten it. It was an alpha's last resort, a way to cut through the lies and the politics with the clean, simple truth of a blade. But it wasn't enough to just have a weapon. He needed his partner. "Cale," he said, his voice a low command to the only guard he knew he could trust. "Get a message to her. The guards will change shifts at the third moon cycle. There will be a new man, younger, less loyal to Valerius. Find him. Give him this." He scribbled a short note. It was not a promise of rescue. It was not a declaration of love. It was a question. He folded it, his heart pounding a frantic rhythm against his ribs. Everything, his life, her life, the future of the pack, rested on this single, desperate gamble. On her. Moments later, Cale was gone, a shadow in the night. Caius was left alone with his ghosts and his hope, a terrifying and fragile thing. He had his plan. Now, he needed his queen.
The darkness in the cell had become a living thing. It breathed with her, shared her silence, fed on her despair. She had found the loose stone in the wall, and the brief spark of hope it ignited had already faded. It was just a rock. It wasn't freedom. She was going to die here, condemned by a life of solitude she had chosen for herself. Her wolf, a miserable, whining thing in the back of her mind, had gone silent. Then, she heard it. The scraping of the food slot at the bottom of her door. It was the wrong time for a meal. A small folded piece of parchment was pushed through, landing on the dusty stone floor. Her breath caught. A trap. A final taunt from Valerius? No matter how hard she tried, she couldn't stop her hands from trembling as she crawled forward and picked it up. She unfolded it. The handwriting was Caius's. There was no greeting, no sentiment, just a single, stark question. The rival attack route. What was wrong with it? Her thoughts spun. It wasn't a promise. It wasn't a plan of escape. It was a request for her expertise, a reminder of her value. In her darkest moment, when she felt like nothing more than a victim waiting for the axe, he was asking for the warrior. He was asking for the scout. He was reminding her of who she was. And just like that, the despair shattered. The poison was gone, washed away by a sudden, fierce surge of purpose. Her mind, so long clouded with grief and regret, cleared. The attack route. What was wrong with it? She closed her eyes, her scout's memory replaying the chaos of the battle, the path of the invaders. She pictured the letters Valerius had used to frame her, the letters that supposedly detailed her treason, and then she saw it. Her eyes snapped open, a flaw, a tiny, perfect, fatal flaw. As the silence roared, she scrambled to the door. "Guard!" she hissed, her voice a raw whisper. A young face appeared at the grill. It was a boy she recognized, one of the warriors whose life she had saved during the attack, his arm now in a sling. He looked at her not with scorn, but with a conflicted awe. He was her chance. "I need you to get a message to the Alpha," she said, her voice low and urgent. "It is a matter of life and death, not just mine, the Pack's." The young guard hesitated, his eyes wide with fear. "I can't. Lord Valerius would have my head." "Lord Valerius left your flank exposed during the attack," Brenna countered, her voice sharp as steel. "He would have let you die to serve his own ambition. Caius fought beside you, I fought beside you. Now, who do you serve?" She watched the war in his eyes. The fear of Valerius versus the debt he owed her. With every heartbeat, she felt her fate hanging in the balance. Finally, with a jerky nod, he slid a small piece of charcoal and a scrap of leather through the food slot. Her hands shook as she wrote. She didn't have much time. She explained the flaw she had found, the lie that would unravel everything. She gave the note to the guard, her eyes pleading with him. "Please, she whispered, the word feeling foreign on her tongue. Trust me. He took the note and vanished. And she was left to wait, her heart a wild bird in her chest. She had done it. She had finally put her life in someone else's hands.
The note arrived like a lightning strike. Cale delivered it, his face grim. Caius took the scrap of leather, his hands unsteady. He read Brenna's jagged, hurried script, and a slow, savage smile spread across his face. It was brilliant. It was perfect. It was the key. The letters Valerius had produced, the ones that framed her, had mentioned her meeting a rival clan contact near the old Hangman's Tree. But Brenna's note was brutally simple. The Hangman's Tree was struck by lightning 2 years ago. It burned to the ground. There is nothing there now but a pile of ash. A forger's mistake, a lie told by someone who knew the old stories of the territory, but not the new truths. A lie that only a true border scout would recognize. He had it. He had the proof. At the same time, another message arrived. A whispered word from a kitchen servant loyal to him. The young guard from the dungeon, Brenna's new ally, had gone straight to Lord Ellian. He had delivered a message from Brenna herself, reminding the old lord of his son's debt, and telling him that proof of Valerius's treachery was coming. The pieces were all in place, the ancient law, the proof of the frame, and now, a crack in the council's loyalty. His plan was no longer a desperate gamble, it was a righteous storm, ready to break. On the day of the trial, the grand hall was silent as a tomb. Brenna was led in, chained, her head held high. She looked every inch the defiant queen, even in her rags. Caius's heart ached, but his resolve was a core of ice and fire. Valerius sat on a raised platform, a mockery of the Alpha's throne. He looked down at Brenna with smug satisfaction. The council has reviewed the evidence, he began, his voice booming with false authority. And it has found, this trial is a sham. Caius's voice cut through the hall like a blade. He strode into the center of the room, his eyes blazing. He did not look at the elders. He did not look at Brenna. He looked only at Valerius. You speak of tradition, of sacred laws, Caius called out, his voice ringing with a power that made the very stones seem to hum. But you have forgotten the oldest law of all, the law of the wolf. When the pack is threatened by a tyrant from within, there is only one remedy. He drew the ancient ceremonial blade from his belt, its polished surface drinking the light. I, Caius, son of Bran, alpha of this pack, invoke the right of challenge. A wave of shocked gasps swept through the hall. I accuse you, Lord Valerius, not only of treason, but of cowardice and incompetence that led to the death of our people. Caius roared, pointing the blade at him. And I challenge you to answer for your crimes, not with lies and forged letters, but with steel. Valerius's face went white, his smug confidence shattering like glass. He looked to the other elders for support, but their faces were a mixture of fear and uncertainty. This was a law they couldn't ignore. This is madness, Valerius stammered. He has no right. He has every right. The voice came from the council dais. Lord Ellian rose to his feet, his old eyes clear and steady. He looked at Valerius with utter contempt. Then, he looked at Caius. The Alpha has made his challenge, and I, for one, will see it answered. The tension broke. The trap had been sprung. Valerius was cornered, his political power useless against this primal bloody right. His face twisted into a mask of pure hatred. He knew he had lost the game. So be it, Valerius snarled, rising to his feet. A challenge. Let the blood decide. The final battle was set, and as the guards moved to clear the floor for combat, Caius finally allowed himself to look at Brenna. Her eyes were wide, shining with a fierce, brilliant light. And in them, he saw not a victim, but the warrior he had chosen, his partner, his queen, and his victory. There was no honor left, only blood. The grand hall, once a place of ceremony, had become a killing ground. The circle was cleared, the pack members forming a silent, breathless wall of bodies around them. And in the center stood Caius, his ancient blade a cold weight in his hand, and Valerius, his own sword looking like a viper ready to strike. The political game was over. This was the raw, brutal truth of their world. Valerius lunged first. He was not a politician anymore. He was a cornered wolf, a whirl of surprising speed and vicious strength. Steel rang, a jarring shock that shot up Caius's arm. He was fast, deceptively fast. Caius parried another blow, his muscles screaming in protest. Valerius fought with the desperation of a man whose lies had finally run out. "You think this changes anything?" Valerius snarled, his blade scraping against Caius's. "You think they will follow a fool led by a feral bitch?" Caius didn't answer with words. He answered with steel. He pushed back, his own strength, his own fury, finally unleashed. He was no longer a king defending a crown. He was a wolf defending his mate. He fought for the woman in chains, the woman whose courage had given him back his own. But Valerius was cunning. He feinted high, and as Caius moved to block, the elder's blade swept low, slicing a deep, fiery gash across Caius's thigh. Pain exploded up his leg. He stumbled, his knee threatening to buckle. And just like that, everything changed. Valerius pressed his advantage, his eyes glittering with triumph. He was a blur of motion, forcing Caius back, back, back. Caius felt his strength failing, the blood loss making his vision swim.
She saw him stumble, and her world shattered. Chained between two guards, she was forced to watch, a spectator to the potential murder of her entire world. Every blow Valerius landed, she felt it in her own soul, a phantom agony. Her wolf clawed at the inside of her, a frantic, desperate beast howling in rage and helplessness. "Mine!" it screamed. "Protect him!" She yanked against the heavy iron chains, the metal biting deep into her wrists, but they held fast. "No!" she whispered, the sound a choked, broken thing. Caius was on one knee now, his sword held in a desperate, trembling guard. Valerius loomed over him, his own sword raised for the final killing blow. In that moment, she heard a faint click. She glanced to her side. It was the young guard, the one she had trusted. His face was pale with terror, but his eyes were full of a fierce, defiant loyalty. He held a small key in his hand. He had just unlocked her manacles. "Go," his eyes said. The chains fell away from her wrists with a soft clatter that was lost in the roaring of her own blood. As Valerius's sword began its descent, a warrior, Lyson, the traitorous lieutenant, stepped forward to block anyone from intervening. "The fight is decided!" he bellowed. But Brenna was already moving. She did not go for Caius. She did not go for Valerius. She launched herself directly at Lycan, her body a projectile of pure, unadulterated fury. She slammed into him and they crashed to the ground. She came up with his own dagger in her hand. "His fight is with the traitor!" she snarled, her voice a low, deadly growl that was more wolf than woman. "My fight is with the coward." The hall erupted. As Brenna engaged Lycan in a vicious, desperate dance of blades, Caius found a new surge of strength. He roared, a sound of pure, primal fury, and surged to his feet. Valerius, distracted for a fatal second, was thrown onto the defensive. And then it was a symphony of violence. Caius and Brenna moved as one, though they fought separate opponents. They were two halves of a single, deadly whole. He was the storm. She was the lightning. Back to back, they carved out a space in the center of the hall, a sacred circle of loyalty and blood. The pack watched, mesmerized. This was not a king and his consort. This was an alpha and his Luna, fighting for the soul of their people. Caius saw an opening. He lunged, his blade a silver blur, and drove it deep into Valerius's side. The elder wolf gasped, his eyes wide with shock, and collapsed to his knees. At the same time, Brenna disarmed Lycan, the lieutenant's sword clattering to the floor. She held her dagger to his throat, her stormy eyes blazing. It was over. Caius stood over the dying Valerius, his chest heaving. "Confess," he commanded, his voice shaking with exhaustion and rage. "Tell them the truth." Valerius just laughed, a wet, gurgling sound. "The pack is weak," he choked out. "It deserves to burn." And then he was gone. In the ringing silence that followed, Lord Ellian stepped forward, his face grim. He held up the letters. "His confession is not needed," he announced, his voice booming through the hall. "His forgeries claim our traitor met her contact at the Hangman's Tree, a tree that has not existed for 2 years." The truth, clean and undeniable, settled over the crowd. The silence broke. And a single, lone warrior began to cheer. Then another, and another, until the entire grand hall was filled with the sound of their names, Caius and Brenna.
The cheering was a distant, roaring sea. All he saw was her, Brenna. She was still standing over Lycan, her whole body trembling with the aftermath of battle. He took a step towards her, and his wounded leg finally gave out. He started to fall. But then, she was there. She caught him, her small, strong frame taking his weight. He leaned on her, his arm slung over her shoulder, and the pack watched as their alpha, wounded and bleeding, was held up by the very woman they had scorned. And in that moment, he knew this was not a sign of his weakness. It was a symbol of their new, shared strength. He looked out at the faces of his pack, confused, relieved, and awestruck. He took a deep breath, the air tasting of blood and victory. "The lies are finished," he called out, his voice hoarse but strong. "We have been poisoned from within by those who value old grudges more than our future." He looked down at Brenna, his heart so full of love and admiration it felt like it would burst. Strength is not found in hiding behind ancient laws. It is found in the heart of a warrior who stands for us all. This is your Luna, and our new era begins now.
Days later, the silence was finally real. It wasn't the dead silence of the dungeon or the tense silence of the grand hall. It was a quiet peace that had settled over the citadel. The dead had been mourned. The traitors had been judged, and a fragile, tentative hope had begun to bloom. She stood on the high balcony of the Alpha's chambers, looking out over the settlement. The northern wilds were a dark, brooding line on the horizon. Her home. But it didn't call to her in the same way anymore. The aching loneliness that had been her constant companion for so long was gone. She wore new leathers, masterfully crafted, that fit her like a second skin. They were a gift from Lord Ellian's family, a uniform, not a costume, a mark of respect. As she walked through the citadel now, the pack members no longer whispered in scorn. They bowed their heads in deference. They looked at her with awe. They called her Luna. The doors behind her opened and Caius walked out onto the balcony. He moved without a limp now, the healers having worked their magic. He came to stand beside her, his presence a familiar, comforting warmth in the cool night air. He didn't speak for a long time. They just stood together, watching the stars begin to prick the deep velvet of the sky. "You are thinking of leaving," he said finally, his voice a soft rumble. It wasn't a question. She turned to look at him. "A part of me will always be a creature of that forest, Caius." "I know," he said. He took her hand, his fingers lacing through hers. His touch was no longer a jolt of lightning, but a slow, steady fire that warmed her all the way to her soul. "That's why the pack needs you. You are our connection to the wild, to the strength we were forgetting." He turned to face her fully, his golden eyes so full of love, so full of raw, honest emotion. It made her chest ache. "They call you Luna," he whispered. "But that is not enough. A pack does not just need a mate for its alpha. It needs a ruler. It needs a heart." He lifted her hand and pressed his lips to her scarred knuckles. "It needs a queen." Her breath caught. A queen. The girl who was too wild, too scarred, too unfit. The woman who refused to kneel. "I don't know how to be a queen," she confessed, her voice trembling. "You already are," he said, his smile so tender it unmade her. "You just have to stand, Brenna. Just keep standing, and I will stand with you." She looked from his beloved face to the dark line of the forest on the horizon. It was not a border between two worlds anymore. It was just home. All of it. Her heart, once a fortress of solitude, was now a shared kingdom. And she let it happen. She leaned into him, her head resting against his chest. And for the first time in her life, she felt the profound, unshakable truth of it. She was home,